before we sort of get into the workshop, I'll say a few words about the New Voices in Cinephilia project, a few words about our brilliant guest, Girish, and go through a little bit of housekeeping, sort of how this event will work. So New Voices in Cinephilia is an event series co-organised by myself and Professor Stephanie Dennison, you can see on the screen there. And it's funded by the School of Languages, Cultures and Societies at the University of Leeds. It's also co-supported or co-hosted with the Centre for World Cinemas and Digital Cultures at the University of Leeds. So the project is really an event series that seeks alternative film cultures, ones that may have been around for a while or emerging ones. We're particularly concerned with how film culture and cinephilia might be transformed through the participation and really the leadership of those who've been traditionally excluded from it, people of marginalized heritage, heritages, sexualities, genders, and so on. So with that in mind, we're particularly thrilled to have Girish Shambu joining us today. Girish is a prolific film critic, author of the book, The New Cinephilia, and the manifesto for a New Cinephilia, which we will have sent round when we were advertising the event. As you can probably tell from the name of our series, his manifesto was very much the inspiration behind this whole project. So it's really exciting to have him with us. Before we kind of start to hand over and just open the event up to all of you, I'd like to say a couple of words about how we'll be running the event. So this is intended very much as a conversational event, relatively non-hierarchical as is possible on Zoom. So do feel free to chip in. It's very much a conversation between all of us. What I would ask is if you'd like to chip in, if you could raise a hand rather than just unmuting yourself. That's just to make sure people aren't kind of talking over each other. So it's a little bit easier to make sure everyone is heard. We'll be looking with eagle eyes to see who's got a hand up. Okay, so I think that covers everything. Without further ado, over to the floor and over to you. Girish, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Okay. So I suppose to start things off, or warm things up, shall I say, I might take the first question, take the chair's privilege, but as I say, everyone's welcome to chip in as soon as they feel the urge. So, of course, you've got the book, The New Cinephilia, the manifesto for a New Cinephilia. How did you come to this idea, the idea that there was a need for a new cinephilia rather than the old one? Has it come out of your experiences as a film critic or other experiences?
Yes. So I guess it's the idea of the new cinephilia. I wrote a book about 8 years ago called The New Cinephilia, and that came out of my experiences as a cinephile over the last 3 decades or so, starting in India when I was a teenager. And initially I got interested in Indian cinemas, so Hindi language, Bengali language, and Tamil language cinemas. Tamil is my native language. And then also foreign films for us, which were English films and other films like French language films. And then after my undergraduate degree, I moved to the US, emigrated to the US, and I got interested in Hollywood cinemas. And what I found consistently, both in India, where I used to try to seek out writings on films, usually, at places like the British Council or the United States Information Service libraries in Calcutta, where I grew up. I would often find in publications like Sight and Sound or The New Yorker an insistently kind of director-centered approach to appreciating film. And when I moved to the US, I found my reading kind of expanded on film. And again, I found a very director-centered approach, a very auteurist approach. And so I was socialized into auteurism very early on in my cinephilia. And I guess the new Cinephilia came out, especially the manifesto, came out of more than 3 decades of slowly accumulating frustrations and disenchantments with an auteurist-driven cinephilia.
Wow, interesting. There's so much to kind of unpack there. So definitely, yeah, the hierarchy sort of brought about by auteurism, but also there's kind of different spaces of cinephilia that you were moving through, from publications like Sight and Sound to work of, yeah. Could you say a bit more about those, the roles of these different spaces of cinephilia?
Yeah. So when I moved to the U.S., and as we all know, cinephilia is not only a desire to see great numbers of films; it's a great desire to read about them, think about them, talk about them. And so I was hungry for reading on films, hungry for writing, and so I discovered many more publications in the US, and I also discovered an interesting message board in the early days of the internet called A Film By. I'm not sure how many of you remember this. I'm not sure if it's still active or not, but starting in the 90s and the aughts, this was a message board I went to often because this is one of the few places where film critics could be found outside of formal columns in magazines and newspapers, and they would converse with others about films. And it was striking that many of the critics that I admired and still admire today were on that message board. And the conversations, as you would expect, A Film By, it was a strongly auteurist film board, message board. And the conversations revolved almost exclusively around men, around creators, filmmakers who were men. And this fact was almost never remarked upon in the several years that I followed the message board. And it was especially what straight cis white male filmmakers were the subject of most of the voluminous discussions. And so this always struck me as odd that issues of marginalized people, women filmmakers, queer filmmakers, people of color filmmakers, issues of justice, issues of like, why are we only restricting our discussions to male filmmakers? These issues were never really entertained in that board. And so I always found it an interesting occlusion. And that started to bother me more and more as the years went on. And even in print publications, I would often find in the New Yorker or Sight and Sound, most of the films reviewed were by men. And so the films I was watching by women that were so interesting me, that were fascinating me, and they were pulling me in into a new direction in my cinephilia, I found that they weren't very well represented in the writings that I was reading. And so that started the kind of, for me, the kind of frustrations with cinephilia that led to thinking more about 21st century new cinephilia.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because I recently inherited someone's back copies of Sight and Sound, and piles, stacks from the 90s. I was flicking through the front covers and it was like, wow, everyone looks really similar on the front of these magazines. So definitely relating to that. I'm aware I don't really want to dominate the discussion. There's so much I could talk to you about, Girish. Does anyone want to kind of chip in or ask a question of their own?
Firstly, thank you, Girish, for a wonderful piece. It was really eloquent and punchy and very, very compelling. I really, really enjoyed reading it. So thank you, first of all. My question is kind of about politics and the context of authorship. I study French cinema majoring the Algerian War, and obviously this is the concept linked to the Algerian War and decolonization. So I was wondering, do you think that authorship was a way of kind of escaping from decolonization, given that it's about kind of, you know, individuals rather than the collective, and it's often quite kind of apolitical. Can you just talk a little bit about the relationship between this approach to film authorship or auteurism and decolonization? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to do the question justice, but I think when we look at authorship, using the author as a lens through which to view cinema, love cinema, appreciate cinema, it precedes the French New Wave, of course. It's also common in the first half of the 20th century in film culture, but it takes on a special importance with the Cahiers du Cinéma era and the French New Wave. And they also had their own, it's a very specific historical moment in a very specific place. And the critics, later filmmakers of the French New Wave, had their own aims and their own objectives and they were rebelling against certain cinemas. And they were also following in a certain capital R romantic individualist lineage. And so it does make sense that authorship was a little bit of an escape from politics and a focus on kind of individual lives, interiority, Parisian urban life. And it's remarkable how many of the critics and filmmakers we associate with the French New Wave and with the founding of auteurism come from a remarkably homogeneous background. They're mostly white. Actually, I think they're all white. They're mostly men. They're mostly middle class. They're Catholic. And so, and in many ways, they're not radical in terms of their politics. You know, they're bourgeois. And so I think this relative homogeneity also goes hand in hand with this individualist focus on cinema. So I would say that yes, auteurism does lead us away from a more collective conception of appreciating films. And if I could add one other thing, auteurism, as we know, is not just, auteurism is not a theory of the cinema. It's not an account of how films are made. It's simply a reading strategy to help us appreciate cinema, to love cinema. And so it's merely one lens, one potential lens out of many for loving and appreciating cinema. But as we know, it became the dominant, hegemonic approach to cinema from cinephiles in cinephilia. And so I think auteurism itself has its place, but it's the uncommonly large space that it came to occupy in cinephilia and film culture that is of concern, because it has a very narrow focus. It identifies a few auteurs worthy of that name, worthy of that status, and 99% of filmmakers who are not auteurs, they don't get their films discussed in those kinds of detailed, thorough, persistent terms. So I don't know if this answers your question, but we can talk more about decolonization as the conversation moves on, because that is also a very interesting and sometimes fraught topic. Thank you for this question, Mani.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Hi, Steph. You're also in charge, so you don't need to wait for me to.
I don't want to jump in too soon and start hogging, so I think I'll just sprinkle lots of questions throughout this session. I'm going to start with one that I'm really interested in, which is this idea of pleasure and value. And you talk about, I'm going to quote you here, for the new cinephilia, with its expansive notion of pleasure and value, films that center the lives of subjectivities, experiences, and worlds of marginalized people automatically become valuable. So I'm curious, you know, sort of the in terms of your understanding of pleasure and value in this context, and are you really basically just being incredibly inclusive, or is there anything that you would actually leave out? Do you draw a line at some point? Are you drawing a line, for example, at the more popular, as in commercially driven certain types of films that might be, you know, ideologically suspect, for example, but still give a lot of pleasure to a lot of people. So I'm wondering where you sit in terms of the popular in its broadest kind of, you know, sort of meaning of the term.
That's a great question. I'm not sure how much I've thought about the specific question, but I can take a stab at an answer. The line that you quoted, what I really meant to convey there was that films by groups of people who have been severely underrepresented, like women, people of color, queer people, because of the relative absence of their work in film culture, when they do make work, it acquires a certain special value because it's giving us insights into lived experiences of people whose work is not seen very much and whose work we've not had the opportunity to see. For instance, I'll give you an example. One of the best things I've seen this year is I'm not sure if we would call it cinema. In an inclusive way, I would, but the TV show Reservation Dogs, I'm not sure if it's available yet in the UK to watch. I think it is, but there are 2 seasons of it. It's a Native American show. And it's a fantastic show because Indigenous people have been so rarely accorded the opportunity of self-representing on the screen. And so there's a writer's room that's all Indigenous, and that includes Two-Spirit queer people and women. And the stories that have emerged from this collective group, there's no auteur behind this, not really. It's kind of a collective effort. The stories are unlike anything I've ever seen in the history of cinema and TV. And so because of the lack of Indigenous representation so far, there's a special value from the show over and above the value of how the stories are expressed through certain formal, stylistic, aesthetic choices, etc. So that's kind of what I meant to say in that particular passage of the manifesto, is that sometimes there's automatic value in having an extremely marginalized group of people create work. That's not to say that we're not going to weigh other factors, like, for example, formal inventiveness, for example, aesthetic inventiveness. Those are important factors. And there are many other factors we can talk about later that feed into the evaluation process of a film. And my own contention is that traditionally cinephilia, especially auteurist-driven cinephilia, has had a narrower band of evaluative criteria that have mostly centered form and style and aesthetics. And I'm arguing for a greater set of criteria that also involve representational nuance and complexity, contexts of various kinds, political, social, cultural, economic contexts surrounding a film, and also production context of a film, and reception context, how films get taken up by various communities. And so all of that somehow needs to feed into how we evaluate a film. And to come back to your to the word you use, Stephanie, I think all of these can give us pleasure. Knowledge about the various contexts of a film or a TV show that we're drawn to, knowledge of those can give us pleasure. So pleasure doesn't only occur when we're sitting in front of a screen watching a film. I think pleasure can accumulate or can also diminish when we learn more about the surrounding context of a film. So I see pleasure as something that's very fluid, and it has an afterlife beyond the viewing experience itself.
Thank you. Thanks for that answer. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's also interesting that you're, you know, suggesting that you would see TV series, for example, as part of, so thinking more broadly, thinking of cinephilia, something that includes audiovisual culture more broadly, which of course then does open up so many more spaces for us to see representation of marginalized groups, etc., etc. So it's key to that. And pleasure, and just, you know, sort of just kind of me summing up in my head what you've just said, you know, a lot of people probably feel incredible amount of pleasure from looking at aesthetics, looking at virtuosity, camera work, etc. But that's only part of the story of pleasure, isn't it? So this is a reminder in your manifesto, because it's a reminder of a lot of things, isn't it? It's a reminder that we can broaden this idea of pleasure. So I've sign me up. I'm all for this. Anyway, I'll not hog anymore. I'll let someone else jump in now. Thank you.
It was very nice to see you, Girish, and see you all. I wanted, I guess, to pitch in just first of all to say that whenever I get a chance to teach the new Cinephilia, it's a great tool. It's lots of fun. The students really take it up because it feels very contemporary, very inclusive in the right sort of way. And when cinephilia traditionally is something that, especially for newcomers into the discipline, can feel exclusive. And actually your book creates spaces that also connect with the past and takes us to the present, for which I'm very grateful as a tool for our teaching. But also, you know, I have a research interest in this, and as a disclaimer, I'll say I'm researching on cultures of cinephilia in Spain. And my question / comment would be kind of with regards to the new versus the old, because kind of making this manifesto for a new cinephilia would imply that the old cinephilia is kind of the past, complete, superseded, right? And it's like we can move on and really expand and further. And my concern is to, you know, the gaps that actually manifest in the old cinephilia. The old cinephilia I see as a way of mapping, and I know it's not exactly the same, but I'm thinking also on Thomas Alcesser's, you know, Cinephilia Take 1 and Cinephilia Take 2. I know the politics of the new cinephilia is different. They don't, you know, both works don't map in the same way. But I'm actually wondering if you could comment a little bit between the dynamics between the old and the new, understanding the old as a map, as a cinephilic map that is far from complete, and it has gaps. And actually those gaps might influence not only how we review the old cinephilia, but how we see the new one. And I'm thinking of this positioning myself from a national film culture, which has for a long time hasn't had access to those international networks of cinephilia, has tried to inscribe itself, but also has fashioned a cinephilia that has to do very much with an international politics, but also with local politics. And there's a way in which, even so, a culture, I mean, a production culture as major as Spain has been absent for a long time from this map of cinephilias, for instance. And to me, that's a gap, and I'm curious about, and obviously there are many other gaps. This is just one example which I feel equipped to discuss. But my question is a bit more general about the interaction between the old and the new.
That's a great question. Firstly, I will say that there was a strong polemical aim behind the new cinephilia, and especially the manifesto of the new cinephilia, for a new cinephilia. And so the old and the new seemed like polemical choices in order to kind of stake a kind of space for discussion and to try to be a little bit bold so that people would be drawn into the discussion and would disagree. And then, you know, those conversations would be hopefully productive. But in reality, I think what I would characterize as the new cinephilia could really also be characterized as a post-old cinephilia. You know, so like moving beyond the limitations of an old cinephilia, but not leaving the old cinephilia behind, but subsuming it into something larger and decentering a few of the things that were kind of hegemonic and dominant in the old cinephilia. So I think that was part of the impulse. Also, there are so many cinephilias in the history of cinephilia. There is no one old cinephilia. So this was, again, sort of a polemical choice to highlight and to maybe monolithize a little bit the dominant cinephilic practices in order to take a stance against it. Like, for instance, I'm thinking of these feminist cinephilias of the 70s. I remember hearing the last time I was in London, and Belen, you and I saw each other and had conversations about cinephilia. I remember going to a talk by Laura Mulvey at Birkbeck, where she talked about helping organize the early women's film festivals in the early 1970s. And she handed out these wonderful, these mimeographed program notes, which were fascinating. So there were all kinds of other cinephilias that were happening in parallel at that time that didn't rely on auteurism and that didn't rely on the work of, dominantly male filmmakers. But I decided to make auteurism and white male filmmakers the kind of center of the critique of the new cinephilia, simply because they had been hegemonic, and that I wanted to try to decenter them in some way. But I absolutely agree with you that there are multiple cinephilias the world over. For instance, in India, manifestations of cinephilia that were very different from the ones that occurred in France or in Germany. And so I think it would be great. I think we need more work of the kind that you are doing, which is to retrieve and foreground and analyze specific cinephilias around the world, so we can develop a more rich narrative. One of the problems with the French New Wave is that story has become the hegemonic story of cinephilia, and so I think the new cinephilia tries to decenter that, despite simplifying in some ways by positing a kind of old versus new dichotomy, which is more polemical than actually true.
I think Maria has her hand up. A question.
Thank you so much. I'm a PhD student, binational PhD student between France and Germany, and actually working on cinephilia from a memory studies perspective, also with a transnational, transcultural focus between France and Germany and other countries. And I would be, as a kind of follow-up question to what Belen Vidal has just asked about the differences between the old and the new, I would be interested in your opinion on the way Thomas Elsässer perceives it, as the new cinephilia has de-Frenched itself. He put it like that in a 2005 article in the edited collection by Malte Hagener and Mareike de Valk. And he says that basically in its current stage, cinephilia seems to have de-Frenched itself, so kind of detached itself from its French origins. And I would be interested in having your opinion on the way he perceives it.
I actually don't remember that particular expression that he used. I would say that since 2005, it's been almost 20 years, and a lot has happened in the landscape of cinephilia, especially on social media and since then. So I would say that French cinema is still of great interest to the new cinephilia, but my own sense is that maybe it's just the circles I move in social media. It's my sense that there's a different set of directors and concerns that are now being foregrounded by new cinephilia. Like, for example, Celine Sciamma is one of the great loves of the new cinephilia. And so I'm not sure if the new cinephilia has been kind of de-Frenched as much as he might have believed. But I think if I could broaden this out a little bit, I see old cinephilia and new cinephilia also as approaches to cinema. So not merely a set of directors, not merely a set of films. One could attempt to put them into those categories. But I see the new cinephilia as an approach that tries to be more inclusive and expansive by including contextual factors, giving them greater weight, etc. So I think it's possible to have a new cinephilia approach to old cinephilia films, where we bring an expanded toolkit and an expanded set of concerns to the same films that we've been talking about. I think we could analyze the films of Truffaut through a new cinephilia paradigm, and it would be a much more expansive analysis. It would include a much more acute gender analysis of Truffaut, who's famously problematic on that axis. So I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think French cinema is still important to the new cinephilia, because there are new tools that we could bring to the French cinema we have always talked about. I don't know if that answers your question, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to add, as you mentioned that you don't recollect the particular quote, it's not so much actually about French cinema, but the French origins of cinephilia, or at least of cinephilia as a term, to put the phenomenon, to use the word defining oneself not as a film lover, film fan, etc., but as a cinephile, like using the term that comes with a particular history related to the French context. But I think what you just said regarding the approaches and the toolkits, that it's kind of also moving away from the limited toolkit that comes with this particular set, if I understand correctly.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so like I understand that you've been talking about cinephilia from the perspective of like the writing engagement, and my doctoral research addresses the direct audience engagement, how Q&As have started to play a very important part in, launching and releasing films in festival circuit, which has, a very specific audience type. And I was wondering if you could elaborate, like within that context of the direct engagement with one's audience, what is the cinephile hoping to get out of that bargain, of that encounter?
So you meant the Q&A encounter with the filmmaker presenting filmmakers presenting films at festivals?
Well, not only that, but like very frequently there's a desire for disambiguation, right? That gets expressed, like there are questions, and then there's yeah, I guess the best starting point for this discussion would be, where's this desire for disambiguation coming from?
I'm actually a big connoisseur of festivals myself. I travel to Toronto frequently because it's a city close to me for various festivals, and the Q&A is a fascinating phenomenon. I'm not sure if I can kind of do justice to this question, because I haven't really thought about the issue of Q&As specifically. But I would say that one valuable aspect of Q&As is that they reveal to the audience a lot about something about the production context of films. So often information that is not available to us when we watch a film emerges through Q&As. And these days, in the age of social media, filmmakers are giving interviews more and more on podcasts, on blogs, on other pages. And so more than ever, I think in the history of cinephilia, we're learning more about how films were produced, the pre-production process, the writing process, the casting process. And so all of this extra kind of paratextual information is also feeding into our understanding of the films, our evaluation of the films. And so in that sense, I think we're being given a kind of richer store of information with which to approach a film. Now, in terms of disambiguation of films, I'm not sure if I'm not sure what I can say that's kind of that would be helpful or meaningful, but that's something I have to think about. Where's that desire for disambiguation come from? Because we see it regularly in Q&As, but it's I'd love to maybe have an email correspondence with you where we can talk about these issues more. But it's a fascinating question that I would have to think about a little bit. Thank you.
Just to finalize that conversation, because you mentioned with the person who asked a question before me, like the importance of the resonance of the French cinephile, who is still resonating. And one of the filmmakers I'm working with is from Argentina, Lucrecia Martel, who's on record consistently saying she makes a living a lot more out of giving workshops, Q&As, presentations than she does from her income as a filmmaker. So I feel, to me, that's a testament of a desire to, like go beneath that surface of the data that is the budget and the production schemes and things like that. So I'm just, increasingly curious about what happens in that space.
Yeah.
But just settle the French influence and bring it to Latin America a little bit.
Right.
Thank you, Girish.
Thank you.
Thanks, and I see Christian, you've got your hand up there.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I'm also a doctoral student from Germany, and I'm writing currently on what I call cinephilic comics. And my question would be about the differentiation between cinephiles and fans. So I would be interested to hear if you distinguish between cinephiles and fans, and if so, how, especially since you, for example, also highlight the collective dimension of the new cinephilia, and also the inclusion of very different kinds of cinemas, different kinds of films. And these are all things that remind me of topics that we also encounter when discussing fandom.
In my understanding, fandom more refers to specific texts or constellations of texts. And like, for example, Buffy the Vampire Slayer fans, for example. And cinephilia seems to me something larger in the sense that it's a kind of desire for the moving image in many forms, and it's usually there's a certain kind of promiscuity that is associated with cinephilia, which is cinephiles pride themselves on being drawn to a staggering range of moving image media, like fiction films, documentary films, old films, new films, experimental films, short films, and so on. So most cinephiles would characterize themselves not as fans of a particular genre or a set of texts, but I think a multiplicity of texts, from around the world, art cinema, commercial cinema. So I think this is one commonality that I notice among cinephiles, like this extremely broad, inclusive conception of the kind of moving image work that they're drawn to. But maybe others might have a different take on this. Thank you.
Thank you. That actually reminds me of a quote I was reading the other day. It's a scholar called Priya Jaikumar who's written an essay called, Feminist and Non-Western Approaches to Authorship. And she describes the auteur theorists as putting forward obsessive, erudite and fanboy cultures, which I thought was quite a funny way of describing.
That's great.
Critics as obsessive fanboys, but maybe a bit unfair. I don't know.
She's not wrong.
So Girish, we spoke very briefly about this beforehand, so that I just explained to everyone how I came to your work was actually quite through an interesting route. So I was doing an online course on a particular approach to Afro-Brazilian cinema. And the very first text that we were given to look at was your manifesto, which has been actually really beautifully translated, very nicely translated into Portuguese, very, very widely discussed in Brazil. So I guess that's the first question for you to share with us, kind of any information you've got about how far, as far as you know, that this has traveled, your manifesto has traveled, and if it's found particular kind of resonances in particular film cultures that that you're aware of. And then the second question coming out of that is one of the things that the Brazilians who've been reading your manifesto have done is that I said that I will send you the link for this so that you can then put it through Google Translate and see what they had to say about you. But they recruited, so one particular online film journal recruited for film critics, Afro-Brazilian film critics, who critiqued the manifesto anonymously. And it was really interesting what was coming out of that. And one of them, if I recall rightly, one of them did suggest that, first of all, they all said as a diagnosis, it was absolutely spot on. That is one thing that stood out for me. But one of them suggested perhaps cinephilia, the old cinephilia and new cinephilia could simply be replaced. This is tendentious, I guess, could simply be replaced with canonical and non-canonical cinema. So I'm wondering, so there's two questions there. I'm wondering what you think of that idea. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say maybe I'm kind of being a little nitpicky here, but there's a lot of non-canonical old cinephilia that is nevertheless the subject of great interest from auteurists. Like, there are a number of B directors from Hollywood who are actually subjects of interest of auteurists who we wouldn't think of as being part of the canon. So when we look at Andrew Sarris's canonical text, The American Cinema, one of the founding texts of auteurism, he actually divides, he obsessively taxonomizes the history of cinema and divides directors into many categories. And it's remarkable how outside of the major canons, I think, I forget the exact names that he gives them. I think the Pantheon, the Other Side of Paradise, he's got these incredibly grand names for these categories of directors. But then many of the directors in that book are non-canonical. They're small directors, but somehow it's the thrill of the chase in the auteur, in the auteurist, where you pursue very little known works by B filmmakers and somehow devote yourselves to them. And so I think there's a lot that's happening. There's a lot that's part of the old cinephilia that's also non-canonical and yet is made by people with dominant identities. Most men who were given opportunities in the studio system to make B movies, when we know that only Dorothy Arzner and Ida Lupino were given any opportunities during that period as women to make films. So I do see the old cinephilia as containing a lot of canonical work, but also a lot of non-canonical work that is nevertheless made by people who were advantaged.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And with regard to how far the text, the manifesto has traveled, have you got any? No.
Sorry, I forgot to answer that. This is still I'm not fully aware of. I still come to learn about this. So I have actually personally traveled to discuss and present the manifesto in a few countries like Germany and Netherlands and the UK and Canada, and also within the US. And I know that it's been translated, as you said, into Portuguese, also into German, into Turkish and Farsi. And I know I've heard from people, I would say at about 30 or 40 universities globally who use the manifesto in their curricula. And it's been interesting to me that many people use it in intro film courses in order to spark a discussion or a conversation. And I'm actually happy about that, because it was kind of pitched, it was written to be discussed. And so I'm glad that it's serving that function in some places.
I wonder if I can follow up on that a bit as well, about really this, the pedagogical uses of kind of the manifesto and the book and the concept of new cinephilia. Because I know we discussed this a few months ago, and you were kind enough to send me Aya's article, A Pedagogy of Reparations, which was a really great read and has certainly changed my teaching. So where do you see the manifesto fitting in with maybe changing pedagogical approaches, or even a pedagogy of reparations?
I think traditionally, and maybe this is a very male tendency, traditionally, is the tendency to make lists. And I know there's a little bit about this in the manifesto. List making is just famous in the history of cinephilia. And for example, even if we go back to the French auteurists, you know, they were notorious for making long lists of the best films of the year, best films of the decade, etc. And these days in social media, that's been amped up even more. You know, end of the year film lists flood our social media feeds as cinephiles. And so I also see like the syllabus, a course syllabus, as a kind of list, a list of films, a list of readings. And so the form of the list form has received a lot of critique, justifiably so. Like my friend Elena Gorfinkel has written a wonderful polemical manifesto against lists it's called Against Lists at Another Gaze, the feminist film journal. But I think we can also harness some of this recurrent cinephilic preoccupation with lists we can also maybe harness it to pedagogical purposes. And I found that syllabi are a great way to introduce new cinephilic directors, texts, approaches, etc., into the educational space. And lots of students who are not yet cinephiles or are budding cinephiles can be brought into the conversation, and their own cinephilic practices might be influenced by choices on syllabi. I think syllabi have long-lasting influences on many of us who are students, influences that may last decades. So I think what people in academia do, the syllabi they create, have very strong material effects in the world. And so I see a strong connection between new cinephilia, the use of lists, and pedagogical aims and pedagogical activities. So the list is one way in which the new cinephilia can kind of enter classrooms.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm reminded of a trend I kind of saw during COVID, which was the creation of kind of open access collaborative film lists. Like the Leeds Queer Film Festival had this amazing spreadsheet of people just recommending queer films, usually shorts, and telling you where you could watch them for free legally, mostly legally. So yeah, I'm wondering if there's scope there then for collaborative film lists in the classroom. You were talking about bringing students into the conversation, so is there a way for them to be shaping syllabi as we're going along?
That would be great. You know, and you know, one list I forgot to mention, probably one of the most famous lists in English language film culture, which is the every 10-year Sight and Sound poll that lists the 10 greatest films of all time. Critics and directors are polled from around the world. And this is kind of a belated answer to Steph's question. Another kind of consequence of writing the manifesto was that I was approached by BFI and asked to contribute a set of suggestions of names of people who could be who could expand the voter pool to diversify the voter pool. And I contributed names of critics and scholars and curators and cinephiles, you know, that I thought would be good additions to that list. And so the results of that list should be out soon, I think within the next month or two. And I suspect there will be a lot of raging social media discussion around those lists. A lot of people are saying that it's probably still going to end up being a very old cinephilia canon, but we'll see. I have hopes that we'll make greater inroads into that list, into that kind of master list of the top 100 films cited in the poll. will make greater inroads than we did in 2012. But I think those lists are also very influential because they influence the choices that cinephiles make when they decide to stream a film or watch it on DVD or whatever. So I think they have a powerful influence on film viewing. So that's another list that could find its way into pedagogical spaces.
Brilliant. I can't wait for that list or the social media furore that's going to follow it.
I'm just sort of carrying on from that conversation and also remembering, you know, that you mentioned that we could talk very usefully about TV series if we're thinking about a broader kind of a sense of what film means. So and the lists, you know, the Sight and Sound list, I noticed that a couple of film critics that I happen to follow on social media had kind of pre-posted, announced, you know, what films they were going to suggest. It seemed to be quite, they happen to be white men, you know, it's not their fault, and they seem to be quite pleased. It was posted in a kind of like, I'm quite pleased with myself about this. Look, you know, so many Brazilians. You know, these were Brazilians that I'm following, but they were white Brazilian men. You know, so there's like the kind of that's one thing, I guess. You know, so that thinking about what we, you know, we're thinking about inclusive kind of filmmaking and lists and syllabi, etc. And the extent to which perhaps we're being a little bit safe if we think that we can, you know, let's bring in more filmmakers from Latin America or from, you know, sort of places other than Europe and the United States. But very often, as you've mentioned already, very often they are themselves coming from a place of privilege. So I guess it's just sort of to remind ourselves of that. I think it's important to remember that, especially when we're thinking about, you know, how diverse really are these new lists going to be. So that was one thing. And I completely lost my train of thought. We were thinking about, oh yes, I remember. The list, so the films that were being mentioned were predominantly feature films. There could be documentary films, but they're feature length films. And that's, yeah, I know you talk about this in the manifesto. You know, if we actually start to think about short films, or not even traditional 15-minute short films, but just those 5-minute kind of thing, specials, or even moving image, you know, visual art works or whatever, if we start to broaden out and think about, as you say, audiovisual expressions beyond the feature film, we're probably going to find, I guess you'd agree, that we're going to capture an awful lot more of those marginalized voices that you were talking about.
Yes, absolutely. You know, one of the great examples of the new cinephilia is, I would say, is a wonderful set, a Blu-ray DVD box set of 100 films, almost 100 films, put together by scholars and curators, Maggie Hennefeld, Laura Horak, and Elif Rangan Kanaki. It's called Cinema's First Nasty Women, and it's coming out on Kino Lorber. I think it's coming out this month. But it's an incredible collection of silent films made between like 1898 to 1926. And these are the films that have never shown up in the canon. And of course, they're all shorts, they're not features, they're silents, they've never received any attention. We've paid inordinate attention to auteurs from the silent era, like Griffith and Chaplin and so on. But these are feminist films of protest, of anarchic slapstick, of gender play, fascinating films that will now be viewed widely. And we wonder, you know, where have these films been? And yet they have been in the archive. And so I think we need more projects like this that move away from the hegemony of, you know, fiction, feature, sound films that end up dominating most cinephile lists. So this is a great kind of shining example of non-hegemonic new cinephilia films. So I encourage all of you to seek out this box set when it comes out in a couple of weeks.
And Lena, I can see you've got your hand up there.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Girish. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm also finishing my PhD on cinephilia at King's College, London, and I'm interested in the relationship between cinephilia and time. And so the old cinephilia obviously had a relationship to the uniqueness of the event and the kind of temporalities of anticipation, and at the same time, sort of the search for a lost time, the repetition of the cinephilic event. The new cinephilia is more associated with a kind of anxiety to keep up, not being able to deal with the steady influx of material that's coming at us. I'm curious where you see the new cinephilia's relationship with nostalgia, because as we sort of saw a decentralization of cinephilia, both in terms of the object and spaces of consumption, we've also been seeing a kind of nostalgia for an old cinephilia. You know, whether that kind of manifests in terms of feelings of belatedness, of kind of coming too late, having missed the heyday of cinephilia, or whether it's a kind of nostalgia for a kind of childlike cinephilia. I'm thinking of films like Hugo, where that sort of old cinephilia is very much narrativized, but also sort of return to older materials that are somewhat outdated, like I'm thinking of 70 mil. I feel like there's a lot of intrinsic contradictions within this kind of contemporary cinephilia, if we think about it that way. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were, where you sort of see the role of nostalgia and cinephilia in this kind of new cinephilia context.
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I'll be able to give you a substantive answer, but to some extent, I think nostalgia, as you say, nostalgia has always been a part of the old cinephilia. And for example, when we look at film culture in the US, which is the environment I know, in the 1960s and 1970s, they were also like the Andrew Sarris generation of auteurists. They were coming a couple of decades after the mid 50s, big boom of the French New Wave, especially the writing. And so I think nostalgia has, for previous periods that were missed in a way, has always been part of cinephilia. I would say that the new cinephilia, because it's open, I think, to a wider variety of forms, maybe than the old cinephilia, in the sense that not privileging maybe the fiction feature film so much, but being interested in shorts, media on YouTube, television. So what you talk about in terms of older forms like 70 millimeter, et cetera, and a lot of experimental filmmakers who still use formats from the 20th century and whose work is still, very much appreciated by new cinephilia. I see nostalgia I see strong nostalgic elements in new cinephilic appreciation as well. So I don't know if I see the new cinephilia stance on nostalgia to be very different from the old cinephilia. Actually, I'm not sure if I see a distinction that I can draw between old cinephilia and new cinephilia. I think they both have certain nostalgic impulses towards periods past, formats past, genres past. But that's a very interesting question, and one that I'm going to have to think about. And I'd love to, discuss this with you in the future. Your doctoral work sounds very interesting to me, and I'd love to learn more about it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll wrap up and say again a huge thank you to Girish for joining us, and thank you to all of you for a really interesting conversation and huge amounts of participation, interesting questions and comments as well. Thanks very much all.
Thank you so much. I loved all these questions, and many of them are things that I've never had a chance to think about, and they really are going to give me some food for thought going forward. And thank you for inviting me, and this was wonderful.
Great, thank you. Thanks all. I suppose I should do the usual plug and say, look out for future events from the New Voices and Cinephilia project. You're all very welcome to join us.